Okay, I think we're starting now. Let's see. Greta Gard, are you with us? See if we can hear her. Yes. Do you want to put your video on as well? Yeah, welcome. So, let's begin. Sverker, do you want to? Okay,
Yeah.
Greta, you can't hear us? Can we hear you?
I don't think so, actually.
No. Okay, so you will have to check your audio settings for your microphone. It will be in your bottom left corner, I think. Or if you want to disconnect and then come back here and try again. I think we can hear you, Greta. So you can try to disconnect, leave the meeting, and then try the link again. Okay, I'll write.
So write it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, you can hear us now? Yeah, good. All right then.
So then we're ready to go. Welcome, Greta, to this session, and where you will play a major role. I am still Sverker Sörlin, for those who've joined me or joined us now later in the day. So we will have a conversation about COVID-19 and the environmental humanities. The introductory speaker will be Greta Gard. She's an ecofeminist writer, activist, and filmmaker, and a professor at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, where she teaches human and animal studies, environmental justice, and LGBT literature. I'm very pleased that Greta can join us. I will just in a moment give the floor to Greta for her presentation. Just want to say that in this session, just like in the previous ones, there is a possibility to ask questions and make comments. And when you do that, you use the Q&A, questions and answers, and we will take care of that. I really appreciate that, because after Greta has finished her presentation, I will ask a question or two. Then I hope to be able to also select from the incoming questions. So once again, Greta, welcome here, and welcome to this Streaming Streams conference, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna shift to share my screen and give a brief PowerPoint that I'll narrate to introduce the topic. Let's see, so are you able to see? Ah, you are, okay.
Yeah.
So let's see, I can start the, oops, there, all right. I'll start my timer. So I picked this image because the theme here is the interdependence and the interidentity of all of us, humans, animals, other more than humans on Earth. And that interidentity is most noticeable through our breath. So I want to invite everyone to, for a moment, pay attention to your breathing. You might come to the nose, the tip of your nose, or notice how the breath comes in through the nose and down your throat and how it fills your chest and your belly. And breathe out. We're going to take just 2 breaths together as a community. Thank you. So breath is really pivotal here. It's one of the elements that we haven't discussed enough in the environmental humanities, the element of air. But this air connects all of us. It's our connection to life. It's our connection to COVID as well. So it's really life and death. And I want to explore that element and others in this talk. When in early April, after we were all locked down, I decided to write an open letter to my community in the environmental humanities and to invite people to consider these intersections that COVID was making so evident as all of us stopped traveling and we saw the ways that other people had to start traveling, like climate migrants. We saw the ways that different species returned to areas. We saw the clearing of the air. We saw the crowding of humans in environments seeking shelter. And all of these brought to the foreground the inequities, the global inequities of employment, of housing, of health and healthcare. And I drafted a letter and started sending it out to colleagues. Different people signed, different people pushed back and edited it. And through that process, I connected with Stephen Hartman at Bifrost, and he agreed to take on the letter. So what we did as a community was invite people to align our actions with our scholarship and our teaching, and really consider the praxis of the environmental humanities in our own lives, to limit our flying, to commit to that, to commit to scheduling meetings and conferences virtually. And indeed, in this lockdown, we're getting a lot of experience with that practice. Also to think about changing our diets so that we were eating more ethically, ecologically, and locally, and seize this as an opportunity to put our lives right next to our scholarship. And if you're interested in reading more about it, Bifrost Online has a cluster on this. And there's also a connection at the end of the letter where you can sign on. Cappadocia University, where Serpil Opperman teaches, is hosting this, and the link is here in the PowerPoint. So I'm gonna stick to my notes so that I stay on time. So in the introduction to our issue, we brought together a diversity of research that confirms these links among species extinction, climate change, healthcare, quality of life, quality of air, and vulnerability to COVID. We see that the nexus of all of these things creates a larger syndemic, which is originally a medical term that talks about pandemics in the body, pandemics of obesity and malnutrition and disease. But as the body, the earth body, what we're seeing is the way that these pandemics interact to create a larger syndemic. And it includes all of these forces that divide us, whether it's human-centeredness, racism, classism, ageism, as we see in the nursing homes and the ways that the pandemic is spreading there, but also sexism and homophobia, speciesism, and the indifference to species extinctions. And the largest problem that I see in all of this is a massive denial or numbing out to all of this information. It is information overload, and this is what leads me to think about the eco-affects of the situation and how people are using their emotions to either shut out information or link to the information that we're being given. We really notice, I live in Minneapolis, and the murder of George Floyd by the police in Minneapolis violently illuminates these connected global pandemics, it creating a syndemic of social disenfranchisement and racist, nationalist, and xenophobic hate. These patterns are reinforced through oligarchies and patriarchies with their linked abuses and crimes of transphobia, misogyny, sex slavery, human trafficking, inhumane income disparities, poverty, forced migration, animal trafficking, genocide, and ecocide. Floyd's final words, "I can't breathe," are echoed around the world by people with COVID-19 who struggle to breathe. But denial is our most dangerous pandemic. As David Quammen reminds his readers in his 2012 Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic So Prescient, there is no natural world, there is only the world. Humankind is a part of that world, as are Ebola viruses, as are the influenzas and HIVs. So I will look at plague literature. I was very curious to see what writers have said in discussing plague literature and how the tools of the environmental humanities can guide explorations of plague literatures from history. And what we see immediately is that plagues and plague writing have coexisted for millennia. I'm looking at Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War from 430 BC and his account of typhoid fever. His words have an uncanny resonance today. Strong and weak constitutions proved equally incapable of resistance, all alike being swept away. So here we have that fear of mortality, which is timeless. Boccaccio's Decameron follows 10 Florentines as they flee their city and the Black Death, which is the bubonic plague, and they self-isolate in a villa for 2 weeks, taking turns telling each other stories of morality, love, sexual politics, commerce, and power. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, modeled on the Decameron, can be read as post-plague literature, with pilgrims having survived seasonal viruses. Both sets of tales emphasize human behaviors, showing how the fear of contagion increased vices, such as greed and corruption, which in turn then led to infection and thus to both moral and physical death. Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, written in 1722, but describes a bubonic plague in London, reported that in 1664, local authorities in some London neighborhoods tried to make the number of plague deaths appear lower than they were by registering other invented diseases as the cause of death. So what I am calling pandemic denial is also a key theme in Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed, written in 1827, but reflecting on 1630, which describes a local population's anger at the official response in Milan. The governor ignores the threat posed by the disease and does not even cancel a local prince's birthday celebration. So the plague spreads rapidly because the restrictions are insufficient, their enforcement is lax, and the citizens don't even follow them. Sound familiar? So much of the plague literature presents the carelessness, incompetence, and selfishness of those in power. It's small comfort here in the US that although the president has failed to act quickly enough to contain the coronavirus, no leader in history has responded well to a plague. And many, including Pericles and the Roman Emperor Hostilian, have even died of them. Mary Shelley's The Last Man is set in a futuristic Britain between 2070 and 2100, detailing the life of the last man who's companioned only by his sheepdog after a devastating global plague. And again, institutional responses are abysmal. Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death is very readable, and it focuses on class, how Prince Prospero decides to bring his nobles into an abbey that's very well provisioned, with such precautions that the courtiers might defy contagion. But contagion cannot be defied, even by the elites. I want to talk in depth about Camus' The Plague, so I'll hold off on that and skip to Icelandic writer Schön's Moonstone, the Boy Who Never Was, set against the backdrop of 1918 Reykjavik, where influenza is devastating the population. The protagonist, Mani, is a young gay man with an interest in cinema. And the final chapter introduces Shun's uncle, who died of AIDS in 1991, thereby narratively connecting the two pandemics that bookended the 20th century, the influenza epidemic and the HIV epidemic, and concluding the narrative with some citizens' violent homophobia. Ling Ma's Severance updates the zombie novel as Shen Fever, which renders people repetitive automatons until their death, a clear critique of being a cog in the machine in capitalism, which is shared by Jack London's post-apocalyptic novel, The Scarlet Plague. So what we see are a number of really bad behaviors that arise from plague affects. So affects of panic and fear give rise to behaviors like hoarding. Blame is sufficient, lots of finger pointing on the elites. Selfishness. We see heroism largely in the medical workers at this point, but also in our neighborhood as people make masks and pin them in Ziploc bags to trees that say child, woman, adult, male, so that people can just take a mask for free. There's a fixation on the numbers of the dead. I know many of us were reading the news every day and watching the numbers rise as if somehow data would give us control over the scene. And then, of course, there's boredom as we are isolating, staying at home, working from home day after day. And a lot of that gives rise to licentiousness and this carpe diem mentality that we see in the beaches. And we all know that the young, ages 18 to 25, are at most risk, both for their sense, their brains don't develop until age 25, as we know. So the executive function of the prefrontal cortex doesn't give them enough restraint. And we're also, as humans, wired for social contact, particularly from 18 to 25. So it's a very difficult place for young people to be. And we see them flocking to the beaches. But the people at midlife have less excuse, I'd say. So here are some pandemic paradigms to consider. And here, in the publication of Sonia Shah's essay in The Nation, she says it's time for a new story about coronavirus because our lives depend on it. And she begins with the 1832 cholera pandemic, which spread from Asia through London, Paris, and Montreal. And it entered the Erie Canal and Hudson River, heading straight for New York City. But New York's leaders did not regulate the incoming traffic because of the demands of commerce, which is what we were hearing in the US. We need to save the economy, so we're going to sacrifice our elders in nursing homes. Save the economy. Shutting down the routes would have disrupted economic interests in 1832. Even stronger was their belief that they did not need to protect themselves because contagion was spread by miasmas, clouds of smelly gas. So this paradigm did not save them. So untangling the web of social relations, environmental factors, and human behaviors that promoted disease, Shah argues that the germ theory allowed scientists to blame a single microscopic speck. This paradigm of invasion, the germ's invasion, relies on ideas of separation and boundaries, which, as I invited you to breathe, shows these are illusory beliefs, and revolutionized medicine. So these interventions about drugs and vaccines do not end a lot of pandemics. And she says it's time for a new story, one in which pandemics are both a biological reality and a social phenomenon. And this MAGA hat, the acronym for Make America Great Again, Melinda Beck, an artist, has revised as portraying that paradigm as a death cult with the coronavirus on the hood of the MAGA hat. So I want to raise a question about plague ethics and the ways that narratives could help us raise these questions. Two books come to mind. One is Geraldine Brooks' story, The Year of Wonders, about the bubonic plague in Eyam, a town called the Plague Town in the UK, and everyone in that town decided to self-quarantine, to not spread the plague by allowing people to leave. And you have to wonder, the novel explores the ethical questions as what moved people's hearts. And once they made the decision, how did they live with the consequences of it when day after day they watched another person that they loved, a neighbor or a family member, die? And the other book here is, of course, Camus' The Plague, which explores the solidarity of community and the compassionate choice to suffer with through 3 characters. And Camus' solidarity has 4 aspects to it. The metaphysical aspect of the common humanity of suffering, the solidarity in relationship of unity and diversity, the capacity to take compassionate action that responds to oppression and suffering, and the refusal to oppress. So I'm proposing that if we choose to bring the plague into our teaching, that we look at the kind of affects and ethics that these narratives give rise to, because fear, which is the predominant eco-affect in a lot of these narratives, does not inspire action. We have to really think what stories can link biological and social phenomena and human agency. What roles do eco-affects such as fear, compassion, and hope, or even denial, play in these pandemics? Whose viewpoints are centered or marginalized? I know my colleague Beth Bartlett has pointed out that Camus uses only male narrators. Yeah, that's a problem, but the topics he's addressing are universal human issues. And how might the environmental humanities perspectives explore COVID narratives for their eco-ethical values? So I'll leave it here and come back to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Greta, for that introduction and for your slides. I would like once again to encourage everybody who wants to ask questions to address them to the Q&A. Just write in and we will take care of them. Meanwhile, I'd like to maybe ask a couple of things. First of all, I learned a lot from this, and I must say I learned a new word, syndemic. I hadn't thought about that. It was very useful, I think, to think about various ailments and problems and diseases, metaphorical and real, that somehow come together and you can address them. And you mentioned teaching a couple of times, and the open letter also speaks quite a lot about how we could enter in and do something as scholars. And you talk, of course, mostly about the environmental humanities community. But let me start by asking you about the curriculum as such. In teaching about these things, do you see this as a way of, could you see it align with existing curricula, or will this disrupt curricula? What sort of magnitude is it that you expect from actually taking this seriously, as you suggest?
Well, a lot of us have core courses and advanced courses that have an overall mission or goal, and we have the options of pulling out and inserting or updating those courses as need be. And in fact, it makes our teaching more vital when we can bring in current op-ed pieces like Sonia Shah's writing, or Arundhati Roy's The Pandemic as Portal. So these kind of readable essays online, particularly as many of us are teaching online during the fall, would allow you to continue in the course that you're using and just bring in more contemporary issues. I'm in a think tank at the Rachel Carson Center, and we're looking at climate affects right now, online, of course. And one of the things that we're looking at is how to infuse a sense of hope among youth, because despair is absolutely paralyzing. And we are asking one another to imagine, when we open up our courses, all of our students sitting in a classroom with masks at distances from one another. What are they feeling as they come into these classes? What are they worried about? And how can we bring those fears and concerns into the conversation in ways that are productive, that help them think about the course content and connect it to other parts of their lives. Because we know, the brain is these synapses that connect. And so if our teaching connects with something else, they're more likely to remember it and use it as a tool.
Okay, so also in your open letter, the question of personal responsibility is emphasized. Do you think that has been not emphasized enough in previous environmental humanities? And also, or maybe is this just a prolongation of tendencies that is already out there? And also, do you think that it's a mission of environmental humanities to stand out in this respect, or would you expect similar things to happen in other fields of knowledge?
I think any field of knowledge that is bringing the environment into their discourse, any field of knowledge that is bringing social justice into their discourse, needs to be taught by practitioners who are not hypocrites. So people look at us, they look at our lives. Our students are very interested in how we're living after we talk about things, and we need to be transparent about that. So we can't ask our students to do anything that we're not doing.
So you are sort of moral templates, or you look at yourself in this regard. Do you think that there is a potential to spread this? Because I'm not sure that most people in universities would say the same about themselves. So you argue a high moral standard, you could say. Is there a chance that you can also impact on or influence colleagues in other areas with this? Not just your own students, but even others.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of that is building infrastructure within your institution and then having to deal with the bureaucracy of your institution, which is always a task of patience and persistence. So, sparking one another as colleagues across institutions, and then knowing that we have a community of purpose, which is what our subtitle was for this, is that we really do intend to intervene in climate change, to intervene in species extinction, to dial down the thermostat, and to do that collectively, because doing it individually doesn't work. It's only a drop in the bucket. So we have to work collectively in that way.
We've received a few questions here, and I tried to just simply make sense of the first one here. How comparable are the different pandemics? You had a long list of books commenting on different pandemics here a moment ago. Is our world not very different when there are multiple stressors, long, medium, and short term? So how much can be guided by these reflections? I suppose this is about also the historicity of this, that each period is in a sense different. Now that you bring them up all at the same time, how comparable are they?
Yeah. Well, we can see the patterns in the affects, the ways that humans respond to pandemics. And the image that I had in the beginning of all these different dots in a sphere, they don't all connect to each other, but through their connections to 2 or 3, they do connect to one another. And the question is the approach one of, as we bring an approach to our scholarship, is our own attitude one of building connections, of seeing connections for the goal of empowering people to make changes, to see the way that my air travel actually affects the breathing quality of air for residents in intensely urban areas. How does that affect that I want to go to this eco-criticism conference where I'm going to say really important things, but in the process, I'm polluting the planet with a climate footprint that's huge. Does that really offset what I have to say? I mean, and the thing about this is there's no one dictating the answers to these. I mean, this is sort of radically democratic ethics. The questions can be raised and each of us have to answer them for ourselves and live with the answers.
Yeah, I think it's these are very important questions. I fully agree, and I've been thinking about them for decades, really. I remember back in the 80s, a conference where an American philosopher was pretty moral, if not even moralistic, in his approach to the environmental discussion. And somebody asked him across the table, "Now, how are you going to travel back to the States?" Well, of course, he had to fly. So there is always this personal collective nexus has been brought up many times. And I think we have been a little bit maybe sort of laid back and said maybe, well, everybody else flies, this is part of a big system and so on. I think very recently it has become more personal again. And I think this pandemic has perhaps speeded this up a little bit, just as pandemics tend to accelerate processes and phenomena, put them on the cusp. So this seems very timely, but still there will probably be colleagues in other fields and individuals who do it very differently. And do you foresee the academic world also being a little bit more fraught by tension around these things, that even morals and personal politics becomes more sort of acute?
That may be, certainly. I mean, people's focus are very narrow on the institution surviving. That's what I'm seeing a lot. But you know, again, David Quammen, one of my heroes, said that, you know, the people who believed in a flat earth didn't change their minds, they died. So some people don't change their minds. And what we're seeing is a lot of leadership from the youth, the climate generation. Your compatriot, Greta Thunberg, and her decision to cross the Atlantic on a boat. I mean, that's phenomenal. It takes so long. It really illustrated how the connections here are so ideological. We have a connection to our idea of time and speed. To be fast is to be smart. To be slow is to be stupid. I mean, these are, the anarchists have done a lot to look at time and capital. So all of these concepts are tied together. And when we decide not to fly, or when we decide to grow a garden, it takes time. And it reconnects us with earth cycles. And perhaps that's a larger purpose, is remembering that speed is not the primary directive. Although things can happen suddenly on this planet, a lot develops over time. And like the climate change forces that we have now, even if we stop flying and driving right now, and also quit the emissions from industrial animal agriculture and deforestation, there's a lot coming down towards us that will not be affected by that. So we would be halting this for our grandchildren.
I have another question for you here. It's a pretty lengthy question, so but I read a bit from it. A lot of the stories told about the pandemic are stories that come from humans. And of course, less anthropocentric stories about our fundamental entanglements with a more than human world are also written by other humans, sometimes othered humans. Could you share your thoughts on what there is to learn from specifically non-human stories, and how we as humans can open ourselves to those registers and modes of communication to be able to hear them? If the caged bird was no longer caged, what would it sing? This was literally the question. I will leave it over to you without trying to interpret it before. Feel free to comment on that question.
Well, this is where different kinds of scientists, environmental scientists, come in and bring the knowledge of what we can know from plants, for example, you know, the plant studies, what we can know about what they are communicating, signaling to one another, because to use speaking and language is an anthropocentric imposition. So through observations, by trained scientists in different fields, we can learn what they are saying. And there have been diverse attempts to narrate from other species' viewpoints in the human animal studies literature. And these still project, they still project onto other species, because we cannot be absolutely certain what they are thinking or what they anticipate. But I think Mark Bekoff does a lot of good work in showing us the affects that we can presume based on animal behaviors. But there's a kind of intellectual humility that's required in saying that we know what they are feeling. We can presume what they are feeling. When my cat comes and sits in my lap and purrs, I can be pretty confident that she likes me and wants to be petted. But I don't know what story she's telling herself about this, or if she is, you know. So I think there's an intellectual humility that needs to be go along with the ethologists and interspecies science and so forth.
I was quite intrigued by your that slide you showed when there were people on the beach, and the list of items you could identify as interesting to reflect upon. Lots of them were various, well, basically effects of different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned also the concept eco effects, and you mentioned vice. And when you talked about things that people do, for example, they become bored. I was also thinking about entertainment. We've seen a boost of the entertainment industry, that the part of it that can go online. Not the theaters, of course. They have been closing, and sports arenas have been also closing. Then that, of course, is about behavior. What do people actually do when they are not in the position to do what they want to do, but they actually are constrained?
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to me that this entire list produces a good range of topics where the humanities actually form the expertise about behavior, about effect, about entertainment, about media, about even being bored, I suppose, is a topic for reflection. Not to say that others couldn't come in, psychologists, for example, or other scholars, but I would like to sort of ask you to reflect on how you look at expertise in the COVID moment. We've heard a lot from epidemiologists and virologists and also economists. You mentioned this "save the economy" phrase that has been used, and you showed that it had historical antecedents. We've seen it play out differently in different parts of the world. But I think many of us have been observing that epidemiologists and virologists seem to be looked at as the real experts, whereas other people have the right to speak, perhaps. But if you, at a closer look, I think your list points to an alternative in the sense. And I think debates would differ between different countries, but here, I think we've heard quite a number of voices that have not just been virologists and epidemiologists, they have been also people from, well, our own fields, actually. So I think it's the expertise is who is the expert on what is an interesting topic in a pandemic situation. What do you think of that?
Well, historically, people have turned from political leaders to scientists or to medical doctors. Those have been the primary leaders in pandemics. So it isn't unusual, as you point out, and even sort of tepid ones like Dr. Fauci, who really is trying to placate Trump and yet give information. That's a very fine line to walk. So others are being more outspoken, thankfully. But I think climate psychologists have a lot to say at this point, and that's a very new area of the American Psychological Association. Environmental psychologists, climate psychologists. We have from the Environmental Humanities and Sciences Glenn Albrecht's concept of solastalgia, the nostalgia for places that used to exist, or being homesick when you're still at home, the eco-grief that we feel. So these affects that environmental humanists can discuss, because they're part of the stories that we tell about our relationship to place and time and to epidemics, really help us talk about and teach our students more insight into their own experiences, because their own experiences are not entirely based on science. There's the information that we're given, and then there's the emotional response that we have to that information, and then there's the story that we tell about it. And so these are places where the environmental humanities can really intervene, and we can do so by bringing forward literary narratives that help people talk about it. So to prepare for this talk, I read Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. And it's short. I mean, I'm mentioning it because there are short pieces that are out there. Thucydides' excerpt on the war, short. And it really generates discussion and helps, I would say, helps students make connections with their own experience. So I'm going to try it. And I think that's a way to go.
Yeah, I got one more final thing, because I know you're going to have to leave in 5 minutes or so. That is to sort of continue in this theme of who can say interesting things. And I myself, being in the environmental humanities as you are, at least for me, it's also a matter of making the humanities even more relevant and address big issues. And if you go back, as I did in my research, investigating the concept of environment itself, you find that after the Second World War, when this concept started rising in its modern version, the one we use today, it was very much confined to a limited set of experts. And that has been, I think, growing over the years, because of adding social science, these economists, and whereas it started very much in ecology, hydrology, some of the core sciences. And we heard about expansion into the planetary in the conversation with Dipesh Chakrabarty an hour ago or so. And I think the arrival of the environmental humanities is part of that broadening of the concept. And I think this is at least, and I think your talk sort of resonates with that. It is, and you're mentioning with the Flat Earth Society, that actually it is an expansion that is about very fundamental new ways of learning to live on this limited planet. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, I think it's really essential that the humanities can bring to bear on the environmental and climate issues. And now, and I suppose that's a question to you, where do you position the pandemic situation in that how important is it, so to speak? Is it a major addition to what we've had over the past several decades, or is it like Diana studies was for a while? When Diana was killed, you had these centers being set up. I mean, how would you, what is the future of terms like syndemic, for example?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And then I also see a question about children that I want to address.
Yeah, please do.
So, what we realize as elites, because you and I and your young colleague here, we are elite. And part of that statement here is for us to wake up to how, okay, I don't own a yacht or 3 houses in Italy, but still, globally speaking, we're well off. And we've been buffered from the fact that pandemics come around at least once a century, that this is normal. And we're so buffered, those of us who live in industrial Western culture, we're so buffered from so many effects. We think that hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes, all of this will be fixed. There's always a backup. I know as a former rock climber and talking to other friends about rock climbing, working class friends of mine said, we get enough thrill just trying to survive. Why would we want to go rock climbing and ramp up the danger? And I realized then that rock climbing was really a middle class endeavor, that we just didn't get enough encounters with death and the thrilling encounter with the rock. So it's important to remind people that life is precarious, especially the elites, because the ways that we're behaving are affecting everyone. The poor people of this world very well know the poverty pandemic, the health pandemics, where healthcare is not even available. They very well know the impossibility of social distancing in crowded dwellings. So this is an opportunity, I think, for us to build in something that reminds us, a memento mori, if you will, that this can happen and this does happen, and to consider our actions in every moment in light of that. And from that, I want to segue to how do we talk to our children? How do we talk to young people about this? And that's why the affect of hope is central to the behavior of agency. That is, in a pandemic, a lot of us feel stripped of agency. We turn to the scientists to be the ones who will save us, and that they will be the heroes. And as you know, a person in Western culture, and particularly US culture, our national narrative is the Western, you know, the lone cowboy out there who's going to save all of us from evil. And so that's a very easy go-to for us. Oh, the scientists, now they're the cowboy, you know, they're the sheriff. And when we surrender our agency, we also surrender hope. And we have to speak to children and to young people in our classes in ways that reminds them of their own agency for change, for compassion, for solidarity, and for changing their own behaviors in ways that affect the planet. And so I really see these two things together, hope and agency, as central to the next generation's capacity to withstand pandemics now and in the future.
So that means your namesake, Greta, is an important figure in mobilizing youth.
He is an important figure, yes.
Thanks to you, Greta, for joining us and for giving this presentation and for the conversation. I will let you off the hook now because you it's time for you to leave, and but feel free to stay on as long as you want. I'd just like to maybe check if there was any more question for Greta here, or I can't see anything. Well, we can read some praise here. What a great message about agency and hope. Thanks a lot. Speaking of hopes, and there's a links to follow up on and so on. On me, it falls to maybe just round off the day we've had. We've had a rich day. We have listened to different presentations. We've heard conversations. I will not make any attempt to come up with some kind of analytical conclusion here, but I just want to make a couple of observations. One is, I think that just in a few hours of an Environmental Humanities online conference like this, I think we have experienced the diversity of the Environmental Humanities. This is really a rich field where many things can come up. We've discussed scale, for example, a concept that has become increasingly important. We've discussed time and temporalities and related that to space and spatialities. Again, very topical questions. There's been several mentions of the non-human world, the various aspects of animals, their experiences, their effect, their in a sense, knowledge, the way they relate to humans and vice versa. And we've also talked quite a bit about the planetary, how global and planetary relate to each other. And I think we have many of us who look forward to Depesh's upcoming book on that. So I think already in the first day we have encountered a number of interesting themes. As for tomorrow, the second of the 3 days here, my role will be played tomorrow by my colleague here in the division and the lab here at KTH. Her name is Sabine Höhle. She will offer opening words tomorrow. There will be a conversation with a literary scholar at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, obviously online. His name is James Aguda. He was among those scholars and colleagues assembled at that Schloss Hohenkammer that I mentioned in my opening remarks. And the streams intervention will be from the Post-Humanities Hub, as it is called, here in Sweden. And there will be a lot of connections to artwork there. And then there will be a final discussion about journals and the remaking of scholarly fields, about scholarly publishing. So make sure that you will tune in tomorrow for the second day. The same hours as today, we will open at 11:30 and the first presentation, the opening words, will be starting at 12:30 Central European Time, and it will finish precisely at the same time as we are finishing now at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So with that, I will thank you all for joining in today. Thanks to Greta again for being part of this final session and for all the previous contributors, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
All right, thank you all. And I will just announce that we have recorded these sessions and they will be published on our YouTube channel. Thank you.